Hello, my name is Anne-Marie Cannon, and I'm the host of Armchair Historians. What's your favorite history? Each episode begins with this one question. My guests come from all walks of life and are people who get really excited about a particular time, place, or person from our distant or not-so-distant past. The jumping-off point is where they become curious, then enter the rabbit hole into discovery, some through scholarly research, others through pop culture, documentaries, and other podcasts. We look at history through the filter of other people's eyes. Armchair Historians is a Belgian Rabbit production. Stay up to date with us through Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Be sure to like and subscribe. It really does help to spread the word. Wherever you listen to your podcast, that is where you'll find us. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to leave us a 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice. You can also find us at armchairhistorians.com. Armchair Historians is an independent podcast. If you'd like to support the show, become a patron through Patreon or buy us a cup of coffee through Ko-fi. Links to both in the episode notes. Hi, I'm Anne-Marie Cannon, and you're listening to the Last Train Leaving Belgium podcast. The Last Train Leaving Belgium is a Belgian Rabbit production. Thank you for joining us for episode 3, part 1 of the podcast.
Especially if you look at the older military historians, older books, that in fact the Germans behaved very brutally and callously towards the Belgian civilian population, and they killed about 6,000 in the first month of the war, really over a period of about 3 weeks. They're very bloody minded, and
In this episode, we speak to Jeff Lipkes, author of Rehearsals, The German Army in Belgium, August 1914, which recounts the brutal World War I invasion of Belgium by the Germans. It's a disturbing part of history which has been swept under the rug by governments and scholars alike. The book also recounts the reason I cannot tell my mother's story without first going back to what happened to her family in World War I. This is a supplemental limited series podcast that is meant to accompany the soon-to-be-released documentary. Stay up to date with the latest news on the documentary as well as the podcast on social media. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Also, be sure to subscribe to us through your favorite podcast platform. If you listen to us through Apple Podcasts, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. All those actions bump us up in the algorithms of the website, which in turn makes it easier for people to find us. So we're here today with Jeff Lipkes. Jeff received his Ph.D. from Princeton. He has authored several books, including the one we'll be talking about today, Rehearsals, The German Army in Belgium, August 1914, which describes what happened to Belgian civilians when the German army invaded in August 1914. He has also written Politics, Religion, and Classical Political Economy in Britain, John Stuart Mill and His Followers, which, according to the economic record, is innovative, provoking, and revealing. His study redraws the map of Mill's intellectual history. And according to the Economic Journal, it is a first-rate addition to the Mill literature. Mr. Lipkes is also working on a book about Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary from 1904 to 1916, titled The Lamps Go Out, Sir Edward Grey, and the Origins of the First World War. He has also, among other things, written articles on the history of economics, the history of economic thought, and British intellectual history. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for inviting me.
Did I leave anything out or get anything wrong in that intro?
Well, I just felt a twinge of guilt about the Sir Edward Grey book because I've put that aside for a while. I'm working on something else on contemporary anti-Semitism, but I do plan to go back to Sir Edward
interesting.
At some point.
Do you have a title for the new book that you're working on?
Well, I'm not sure.
Okay.
I don't really have a good title yet.
Interesting and timely. So we're going to really talk about the first book I mentioned, Rehearsals, the German Army in Belgium, August 1914. If you could just, give us some background about the book.
Well, okay. It's towards late in my teaching career. I'm retired now. I was teaching a lot of classes in 20th century Europe, 20th century world, and then the world wars. These are popular classes, unlike classes in the history of economic thought. You get a bigger draw. Mm-hmm. And so I got into the two world wars, and what you run across in the standard text, and in the one thing why the courses are attractive to students is you wind up showing a lot of documentary footage, especially World War II, because there's so much good documentaries.
I don't know about you, but if I was given the choice of listening to lectures about the theory of economics or watching documentaries about World War I, I'd definitely pick the documentaries of World War I.
And there's a standard one now. And it reflects the popular opinion at the time. The authors were not, didn't know very much about really what went on in Belgium. But that was the consensus, was that these so-called atrocities were just manufactured by British propaganda. They were dreamt up in London. Or some historians said that, they did respond harshly to Frank Terreur. Frank Terreurists were the supposed guerrilla sharpshooters, who in fact didn't exist. There was no civilian resistance to the Germans. But either these atrocity stories were just fabricated entirely, or they were exaggerated, and that the Germans really behaved quite well, and that Allied propaganda mills just churned this stuff out in order to mobilize public opinion behind the war. So I was curious about this, and I just began looking into it more. And I really, at one point, decided to write a short book because I discovered, especially if you look at the older military historians, older books, that in fact the Germans behaved very brutally and callously towards the Belgian civilian population, and they killed about 6,000 in the first month of the war, really over a period of about 3 weeks. They were very bloody-minded, and
so basically, the jumping off point for Jeff Lipkes' book and his research is this discrepancy between the accounts of what actually happened in Belgium at the opening of the invasion, often referred to as the Rape of Belgium. There's this idea that the atrocities committed at the hands of the Germans against the Belgian people was not really as bad as indicated by survivors' first-hand accounts that were reported to the British government in 1915 and accounts taken after the war. There was and still is a standing belief the stories of civilian massacres were nothing more than propaganda designed to sell the war to foreign governments, including the United States. And to complicate things, there were reports of specifically horrific acts that did not actually happen. Sensationalized accounts told by non-witnesses, which in the end helped to delegitimize first-hand witness accounts.
It's the historians subsequently in the 20s and 30s kind of seized on these stories and said, look, these were all made up, in order to discredit the real killings that the Germans committed, the real war crimes. Now, I looked carefully through newspapers for the first months of the war. These stories do not appear in any newspapers, any reporters, but they're stories of fingers and hands being chopped off, breasts being chopped off, eyes being gouged out. They're these gory tall tales that really did not happen. The Germans.
So why do you think because I've read about this, and this is one of the problems with apparently the credibility of the real stories that happen. Why do you think that exists?
Well, it was really the Belgian civilians were pretty accurate, because I looked very carefully at the these appendices, this one appendix in particular. But it was the soldiers, for whatever reason, they just, they were repeating gossip that they heard. It never took place in their own company or their own regiment. It was always somewhere else. But and then these were, you could see why these would have a sort of sensationalistic appeal, because there was even a story about British soldiers being crucified, nailed to a barn door. So they're just more lurid than simply men being taken out of their homes, marched to a town square or to a field, and gunned down. I mean, that because that's what they did repeatedly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, but I do want to repeat that the British press, I looked at 7 or 8 of the leading dailies, and they talked about some of the real killings that went on in some detail, especially Leuven, which was the Oxford of Belgium. That got a lot of coverage. There are very, very few stories. 1 or 2 were carefully qualified by the reporters about these really outrageous and gory atrocities. So I don't know. It just must have taken root after the publication of these appendices in April. But in any case, so
and that the atrocities and the thing that is referred to by some as the rape of Belgium never really happened. And so, okay, let me ask you one question about that. Do you think that it was because they were just trying to play it down on purpose, or because there was that evidence that no, these stories really didn't happen, so none of the stories happened?
Part of a general revulsion to the war was that the British commanders were buffoons, and American commanders too. The line was they were lions led by donkeys, something like that.
Oh, okay.
Along with that was a misinterpretation of the Versailles Treaty. It was because the Versailles Treaty was taken to be this harsh, draconian, totally unfair peace arrangement, and it's just not true, really. Right. There's all this. This was just one part of the general reaction to the war, and what's interesting is that it was actually both on the left and the right, but primarily on the left that the skepticism was repeated in America and in Britain. But in Germany, it was the right wing that obviously wanted to discredit the stories about the behavior of the Germans in Belgium, and it was the left wing that was really interested in exposing what had really happened. So it's kind of an interesting switch there.
So in a weird twist of history, different countries, different factions in different countries at different times had something to gain from the sanitizing of the atrocities committed at the opening of World War I against the Belgian people. Well, so the way that I come into this story and into your book is I grew up, my mother was Belgian. She was born in Belgium. She was 7 years old in World War II when the Germans invade. A harrowing story. That is what the documentary is about. It's about her experience through the filter of her daughter, me, but also she died 2 years ago. I do have some personal interviews with her in Belgium. So I grew up with these stories. And one of the stories that I was told was about World War I, and it was about my mother's great aunt, and her name was Adele Oubion Charlier. And my mother was close to Adele, and I think about it because I thought, well, she was a great aunt. How close could you have been? I have a great nephew. It means more to me now. It hits home a lot more. So my mother would tell this story about Adele's family was massacred in an aqueduct beneath the bridge in Neuf, which is right across the Meuse River from Dinant. And you even wrote in your book that the Neuf massacres were especially horrific. So I knew this story. It was kind of a legend in the family. We knew that. We knew the story about my mother because she talked a little bit about that too. But later on, flash forward, my mother's in her late 70s and I am in grad school. And my background is I'm a storyteller. So I was getting my master's degree in creative and professional writing, and I was studying multimedia writing because I was really interested in the different ways that you could tell, stories, that I could tell stories. So I started this journey of this documentary, and the podcast episode 1 is actually the beginning of that journey. That was a project I did for school. Probably about 2 years ago, I was contacted by a cousin. The cousin, Guy Charlier, is actually the grandson of Adèle Aubillon Charlier. Guy's father, Georges, was one of the 3 children of Adèle Aubillon who survived the massacre beneath the aqueduct in Neuf, Belgium, in 1914. And he actually sent me a link to your book, and that's how this all started. And what became of that is that, you have a very detailed first account that talks about what happened to Adèle's family. The details just make it so much more real to us. And as I started researching this, one of the things I found out is exactly what you talk about, and the fact that basically this idea of the rape of Belgium was a farce. It was propaganda, and it didn't really happen. And yet, in my family, this has always been a kind of a part of our family narrative. So that's how I found you, and that's why this is so important to me. And one of the other things that I found really frustrating was that whole idea that the history books and whatever I was reading was telling me, oh, it really wasn't that bad. And it was that bad. And it is carried in the psyche of my mother. And flash forward, the Germans invade Belgium in World War II. Where is my mother staying? She's staying right there in front of that aqueduct where those people were killed. She's 7 years old, and this legend is, ingrained in her head. And she was already afraid of the Germans. And oh my God, the Germans are coming again. And her father is off in France fighting the war. So, and her escape to France is a harrowing story. So I was really frustrated. And I don't know if hurt is the right word, but I'll just use that word. I was kind of hurt and offended at this idea that these horrible things didn't happen.
Yeah, I sympathize completely because I don't have relatives in Belgium, but I'm not Belgian myself, but I felt the same thing. This a sense of kind of outrage at the injustice that was done to the Belgians. One time with the invasion, but then in burying it, in disparaging the testimony, because there's so much testimony.
And I just have to say, it was such a gift to find you and to find this book.
Thank you.
Like I said, my mother was very fond of her great aunt. There was the family legend and the story that had been passed down. The account that you give in the book of Adèle and her family actually clarifies a lot of things that we were kind of mistelling each other, because I feel like I can count more on Adèle's account than our family legend. And it's interesting, that whole idea of how, we pass things down from generation to generation. But that was such a gift for me, and also for my mother, to be able to read that account. I do have to say that I've been reading the book again, getting ready for this interview. It's very heavy. It's very heavy. And it's like I had to step back from it, but it's painful. It's a painful history.
It is, yeah. But it was criticized for, excessive obsession with the grim details. But I just didn't want to hear that the myth about the invention about the British propaganda machine and the invention of so-called Belgian atrocities. But of course, your objective in writing a book is never realized. That's still, people still persist, and although historians are better now, but journalists still will disparage what happened.
So, why did you write the book ultimately? Why did you want to put that out there?
Well, again, it was just a sense of injustice, of correcting this misinterpretation, especially in this film, the most best source of information, because it was shown in classrooms across the country year after year, was this film called The Great War in Modern Memory, something like that, of Jay Winter was the author. And it was just disseminating this erroneous picture. And I just felt kind of aggrieved about that. And I just wanted to set the record straight. I couldn't believe, going back and first reading, first I read these military stories. Barbara Tuchman is certainly a popular author known to a lot of people, the Guns of August. And she actually gets some of it right as far as the scope of the killings. And then some of the military historians do. But then, then there's just tons of sources in French, but because all official documents were in French, even for events that took place in the northern Belgium, in the Flemish-speaking areas, provinces. But there's, and I did want to, give credit to. I've used different sources to put together this story, but a very important one was this multi-volume work by two priests, or they were clergymen of some kind. I don't know, Schmidt and Neuland, who I think partly because they were priests were able to get people to open up afterwards and tell in detail their stories. They were trusted figures, and so a lot of the details do come from them. They in the early 20s, they were interviewing the survivors. So, but there's just lots and lots of material out there, and it was just an urge, a desire. And again, I thought it was going to be very short. But the first book was over 800 pages. I thought it was going to be a very short look at what the Germans actually did, but I just got carried away, and I went to Belgium, I think 3 times, and looked in the British archives as well, because all the priests in every diocese were required to submit reports about what happened in their diocese. So in all of the archdioceses, there are records of these priests, their handwriting, of what went on. And some
who did they submit the reports to?
To the bishops.
Okay.
The bishop was in Macmillan, or Malines, as it's called in French, and Liège and Namur, the 3 bishops. And so they're in those archives. So they had to write these reports, and then plus just lots of people just published short memoirs, and there were newspapers and journal articles of eyewitness accounts of what happened. So there's just a lot of material out. There's just no excuse for repeating these lies about
right.
what went on.
So are you Belgian? Are you French? Do you speak French? Do you read?
Well, I do. I do read, and my spoken French is now pretty terrible, but it was okay enough to talk to people. Then I wished it was better, but I did interview people actually in Dinant. There were still a few survivors, but I didn't speak with any of them. But I did speak with nieces, nephews, children, and grandchildren. So I did get some firsthand stories directly that had not been published or were not in archives.
Right. Wow. So I want to read this excerpt. It talks about, the idea. And one of the things I really appreciate about your book is that you're sharing these stories. There are people who experience them, and everybody's perception is different, but it is still a really important part of the fabric of the truth in the bigger picture. And so one of the things you say is, there is no one story to tell. There are rather multiple points of view on a given historical event, and one has to make heroic efforts to avoid privileging those of the dominant race, class, or gender, or in wars the triumphant nation or colonizing power. I thought that was really powerful and kind of consolidates everything you just said about why you wrote the book. For me, that's the truth. There's scholarly truth, and then there is a bigger, greater truth, which takes into consideration the facts, but also the emotional experience of people. I feel like this is what you do with this book, and I, really appreciate it.
This is, there's a maxim, history is written by the winners, but in this case, it actually wasn't, because it was the German version that really got disseminated and propagated, because the Germans were after the war, they were very interested in clearing their name. And so they spent a lot of money and had a lot of people working on these magazines and journals that were were dedicated to putting out their story, and they succeeded. The version, their version got accepted and adopted by historians.
And then you also say in the book, you say, however, I believe the underlying reason for the continued unwillingness of journalists and popularizers to acknowledge what happened in Belgium in August 1914 has to do with the seductive appeal of revisionism. Views inspired by the bitter reaction to the Great War during the 1920s and early 30s, though long rejected by most scholars, have retained their grip on public opinion. Briefly, revisionists believe that all the nations that went to war in 1914 were equally to blame. They slithered into war. I thought that was really interesting. And could you tell me a little bit more about this idea of revisionism?
Well, sure. It's attractive to think of yourself as skeptical, cynical, as, our parents and grandparents were swept away by propaganda, but we know better, it's a very self-flattering idea. And that was part of the attraction. And then part of the attraction was a legitimate reaction to the kind of demonization of the enemy that went on in all the countries, especially in America.
So I want you to tell us about the title and specifically the word rehearsals. Why that choice of words?
Yeah, well, I got some flack for that, but that's why I did try to explain in the afterword a little bit more about that, because obviously this is not comparable to the Holocaust. It is in some ways comparable to what happened when the Germans invaded Poland. Now, they were very careful when they went into Belgium the second time. They were originally they were careful about treating the civilians. They remembered what had happened and how much money it had cost them to try to erase the image of the barbaric Hun. So they had very close instructions from Hitler on down to behave better towards the Belgians. But then there was actually this time a genuine resistance that formed after a couple of years, and I think 17,000 Belgian civilians were killed, as in somewhat connected to the resistance, and not 29,000 Jews and others were killed in Allied bombing too. But they, in Eastern Europe, they just behaved with the same brutality. And my point is really, when in Rehearsals, was that it was not, some people give too much credit to Hitler. He was only in power for 6 years before in reshaping German mentality and German outlook on things. He was in power just 6 years when World War II started, and you can certainly affect the mindset of children in school, but grown-ups, no. These some of the ideas that were responsible for the barbaric behavior of the Germans in the war long predate the Nazi coming to power, but there were form of the nationalism took in Germany, the form of the German militarism, which was very distinctive from the, for instance, dueling, which was part of the military ethos, was important, very, very important in Germany in the late 19th century, early 20th century. It had really died out elsewhere in Europe. There was guys didn't duel anymore. So there's this very different culture, and certainly a different military culture. There was just a glorification of, for instance, another really quick comparison. Honor was so important. You were always, you carried out a duel or challenged somebody to a duel to defend your honor or the honor of the Kaiser's honor because you were wearing the Kaiser's uniform. There are 45 words with the prefix of honor in German, and there are only, I think, about 5 in English. So honor was very, very important. It was very important. They were very status conscious, and you had to be a reserve. If you wanted to be anybody, you had to be a reserve officer. Every guy, a middle-class man, was a reserve officer. And you were taught, there's another German word, Schneidigkeit, sharpness. You were taught that the duty of the officer was to be very easily offended, ready to challenge somebody to a duel, to not put up with any nonsense, to be just, intolerant. And that's part of the culture. There are many, many examples of this. So there are these differences. Another difference is the nationalism was just much more extreme. And it also was during the war, everybody became more nationalistic, and people were nationalistic before the war, but it wasn't quite. It was more kind of celebrating your own history and your own culture. But the Germans just carried it a couple of steps further. And, there are these wonderful statements about, God, because the Lutheran pastors in particular authored these kind of hair-raising sermons about God, Germans being God's chosen people, and God must be pleased to see himself mirrored in the German soul. These historians, the writers in Allied countries and in neutral countries just had a field day going through these pamphlets published by Lutheran pastors, finding these gems.
Mm-hmm.
And the other factor was anti-Catholicism too. That was responsible for the treatment of the Belgian population, because they just thought they were bewitched by their priests. And 45 priests were executed in those just a short time, less than 3 weeks, because they were supposedly leading this guerrilla campaign. It's just ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a factor as well. And so anyway, all these things predate Hitler and contributed to the behavior of the Germans during the Second World War. That was the point of the idea of the title of Rehearsals.
So I guess what I got out of the title was this idea that the brutality that was carried out upon the Belgians somehow translated into the brutality of the Holocaust. Am I wrong about that?
Well, that's the closer analogy is what I mentioned is the treatment of Polish civilians, just doing exactly what they did in Belgium, except on a much bigger scale. In the same time period, they killed I think 17 or 18,000. This was the army before the real persecution of Poles begins, just burning villages, shooting all the men, usually all the men, sometimes women. But there is this interesting fact that Hitler's anti-Semitism was never originally that important a part of his appeal. I mean, he actually had to tone down the anti-Semitism when he won his big victories in the 30s. I used to ask students, guess how many votes Hitler got in the 1929 election? All right, he got, I believe, 2.7% of the vote. He was not a popular figure until the Great Depression hit. So yes, of course, Germans were anti-Semitic, but they weren't nearly as anti-Semitic as if you had been asked in the 1900s, you would have said Russia and France because of the Dreyfus affair. If you'd been asked in 1930, you would have said the Poles because of anti-Semitic legislation. But of course, there had to be a lot of anti-Semitism for everybody to cooperate, the people who cooperated with the Holocaust to carry that. Mm-hmm. But there are these other factors that I was talking about that figure in the treatment of Jews as well as the treatment of Poles mm-hmm. and other Eastern Europeans. So that was the point that I was trying to make too. So there is some relevance for the Holocaust. One famous couplet was, "And the world may once again be healed by German ways." Have this very exalted pride in Germany, and the one Danish theologian who one of many people who collected these quotes, concluded at the end of his book that he was trying to summarize what they said. All of these German pastors. Germany is not only the strongest nation in the world, but is a nation which, without comparison, stands highest in every respect. The Germans are the chosen people, the crown of creation. All moral virtues are, in the German, nothing but his natural inborn qualities. All that is noble, good, and beautiful can therefore be described as German. It follows that the German people as such cannot possibly do wrong. It will always be preserved from wrongdoing by its inherent nature. But, specific quotations, that was from the summary by the Danish theologian. Then there was just the belief also that the Belgian civilians were told this, repeated this many times. They were told small nations are going to disappear. I mean, Germany's destiny was European hegemony, and many you keep reading this soldiers, but more often officers would tell somebody Belgium will disappear.
Yeah, it's interesting because it seems like during the occupation, the Belgians in both wars were in a state of limbo. And one of the compelling stories that I talk about in the last episode that I released, episode 2 of the podcast, was my cousin's mother was a courier. She worked for the census, and people were against her because she was they said she was collaborating with the Germans, and yet that's not really how it went down. They would do things like go out to the farms, because what the census was for the Germans, and they would go out to the farms and take inventory of their stock, the animals and the crops and that type of thing. And then they would tell the farmers, tell us how many you have. And then they would say, okay, we're going to report this many, and it would be a fraction of what they have, and you need to hide your livestock or whatever it was. And it just seemed like to be in that place of, this is my country, this isn't my country, how do I remain loyal to my country? It's another totally interesting rabbit hole to go down, and yet they persevered. Somehow they persevered. I want to read one more excerpt that talks about some of the things that we've been talking about that I highlighted, and get kind of your feedback about it. So this is also in the foreword to the second edition. A couple of questions may occur to readers at this juncture. It has been asked for at least a generation, and not only by Germans, how long citizens of the Federal Republic must be made to feel guilty for the murders committed under the Nazi regime. Is it not unsporting to now add war crimes committed by soldiers of the Kaiserreich to the burden of German guilt? Scrupulous historians can only answer that the feelings of the descendants of the individuals whose action they described cannot be any of their concern. But it is also safe to say that few historians, unlike ordering executions in 1914, believed in collective guilt, and fewer still in transgenerational guilt. Nonetheless, the actions of the German army in Belgium are part of the historical record, and anyone wishing to explain German history between 1871 and 1945 needs to account for them. I had somebody tell me about this documentary that I'm doing. Who would be interested in it? Haven't the Germans paid enough? What do you say about this idea of haven't they paid enough and the German guilt?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that I was accused by some critics of suggesting that there was a German national character that was brutal and not humane, and but I'm certainly not saying that. Obviously, the Germans have transformed themselves since the war, the successive generations, and they were and before they were, before the unification of Germany, they were called, the nation of poets and scholars. They were not. Prussia was always militaristic, but the rest of Germany was not at all. So I was certainly not saying that this was in these traits that came out in expressed themselves during the invasion of Belgium. But again, I just, it's history. It happened, and particularly what was particularly imperative for me was that it was blotted out. It was just discredited, and I just wanted that story to be told, and that people would not repeat this misinformation about what had happened.
We're going to stop here for today, but be sure to join us next week when we pick up where we left off with Jeff Lipkes. I need to warn you, though, the subject matter is quite disturbing and not suitable for all audiences.
Yeah, it was so vile. It was just, there was no, what was incredible was one of the women actually saw, when she saw the soldiers with their guns leveled, she just, pleaded. I mean, she looked pleadingly at them and held up her baby, her little infant.
Oh, yeah.
And they would still open fire. That was the order that was given, fire on them. It was just so heartless. And then
Just a reminder, stay up to date with the latest news on the documentary as well as the podcast on social media. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Also, be sure to subscribe to us through your favorite podcast platform. If you listen to us through Apple Podcasts, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. All those actions bump us up in the algorithms of the website, which in turn makes it easier for people to find us.